I'm Margaret Pomerantz, President of Watch on Censorship, and I want to welcome you all here tonight for what promises to be a most interesting dissection of an issue that's confronted us certainly recently. Some of us were appalled at the sight of the Henson photos being carted out of the Rosalind Oxley Gallery by the police. Some of us felt that was totally justified, and it sparked a lot of talk in our community, and we're going to tease out those issues tonight in hopefully a very interesting way with this marvellous panel. Tonight would not have happened without the amazing efforts of two wonderful people, one of whom is Raylene Shannon from Watch on Censorship, Herculean effort from her, and Tamara Winikoff from NAVA, the National Association for the Visual Arts. They've worked amazingly hard to get this together tonight. And there are just a few other people that I want to thank as well. Obviously, I want to thank Elizabeth Ann McGregor and for the MCA for their generosity in giving us this venue for tonight. I want to thank the Hassel Group for printing our posters. I want to thank Frankel lawyers who are always supportive, but especially tonight. And I want to thank Rob King of AVI One Proprietary Limited for his support tonight as well as all the volunteers who are helping out tonight. We have a very formidable panel for tonight's forum, and I'd like to introduce them now. We have David Marr, lawyer, writer, journalist, and Vice President of Watch on Censorship. We have Ian Howard, who is an artist. He's Dean of the College of Fine Arts at the University of New South Wales and also Chair of the National Association for the Visual Arts. He'll be bringing an artist's perspective to tonight's discussion. Tony Bond is Assistant Director of the Art Gallery of New South Wales and Head Curator International. He'll be speaking from a gallery's perspective. Hetty Johnston is Executive Director and founder of Brave Hearts Inc., an organisation which works to prevent child sexual assault, which provides support for victims and which advocates for increased awareness, education and research. Julian Burnside QC is a barrister, writer and President of Liberty Victoria. He brings a legal perspective to art censorship. Clive Hamilton is a writer and commentator and immediate past Executive Director of the Australia Institute. He brings insight into community standards, public moral codes and limits to freedom of expression. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of them, and I'm handing over to David Marr now.
I'm the policeman of the proceedings. Each of the speakers on the panel will speak for about 7 or 8 minutes, something like that. By the time we've gone down this... 10 or 12. They'll be speaking for about 10 minutes. By the time we've gone down the table, I know that each member of this panel is going to have something that they'll want to explain, personal explanations or perhaps questions of each other. We'll do a quick run down the panel again at that point, and then we'll open the proceedings for questions. And I'm hoping that we will have half of us and half of questions as the reasonable democratic division of tonight's responsibilities. Okay, we will get underway straight away with Ian Howard, and there or here? I think probably there. There, okay. If they go on forever, I'm going to do what... I'm going to get started. Sir Anthony Mason threatened to do once. I heard him about a year ago. He's about 85 now. He said that if they went on a bit long, there'd be a ring. But if they went on much longer than that, he would use all the strength of his 85-year-old body to crash tackle them to the ground. Okay, Ian. Okay, I'll make a bit of a race of this, but before I talk as an artist, I'd like to actually make some reference in relation to my day job, which of course is the Dean at COFA UNSW. And I want to talk about some information, then some observations. The information, not surprisingly here tonight, is about Bill Henson. In 1988, we in fact from COFA ran the French-Australian Art Exchange. Had people like Bronwyn Oliver, John Nixon, Julie Rapp and Bill Henson went in that show across to Paris.
There was an observation that I could make about that, was that in fact there was some artist criticism at the time, 1988, the bicentennial, dealing of course with the French, because the French were still testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific. So a number of local artists were critical of in fact me and that project. The French artists that came back included Christian Boltanski and at Messager Sophie Karl, hardly kind of radical right, pro-nuclear type folk. So it was an interesting experience that we were initially involved with Bill in. As well, just if we think about censorship, which is the theme for this evening, censorship and closing down, if you think about the opposite of it, kind of acknowledgement, support and encouragement, well then colleges of art, universities have the capacity to endorse and in fact celebrate achievements through the process of honorary doctorates. COFA, over recent years, has given one to James Gleeson, Bernice Murphy, Joan Brazel, Ken Unsworth, Bert Pflugerman, for instance. This is something that we can do, the opposite, in a sense, of censorship. Just this year, just our recent graduations, we gave them to Michael Nelson Jacamara and George Gittos. In 2006, we gave an honorary doctorate to Bill Henson. Now, in terms of those processes going through the academic board of a university, the university's council, Michael Nelson Jacamara, not a problem. Bill Henson, I'm sure it was considered. George Gittos, probably more contentious, but it's the role of an institution, I think, to be supportive in that way, in a sense the opposite of censorship. More information coming from an art school. In 1991, Gary Manson, who's in fact here in the audience with us tonight, and his partner Debrilla, Gary was a COFA MFA student. He was working and studying the Marquis de Sade, working with adult and adolescent bodies or consenting bodies. He was in fact preparing a crit in his studio for a COFA lecturer to come and talk to him about his MFA work. He left the studio, there was a fire, the fire brigade turned up, the fire officers said, "What have we here?" He was charged with 6 counts of corrupting a minor. It went to trial, he was convicted and sentenced. In fact, he got a 3-year charge, which in a sense was on good behaviour, so there was, in a sense, no charge. Certainly COFA went along to support Gary. The argument about whether it was artwork or not was disallowed. They were really just interested in the corrupting a minor case. Some of the work, in fact, that was discovered by the firemen had in fact been on public display for some period of time. Other work hadn't. It was a critique. It was Gary bringing out his most interesting work, in a sense his most adventurous work, which was discovered. My observation here is that there was a certain determination, and again you could talk to Gary about this, there was a certain determination to prosecute. Certainly guilty, but they couldn't work out what the penalty would be because there kind of wasn't a crime. This is a true case. I was surprised it didn't emerge in relation to the recent Henson issue. So my point here as well is that there are works in progress, which are one thing which an artist might work on, but then there's another process of critique and selection and editing, obviously, that artists would go through. Third piece of information, George Gittos. George, of course, is the extraordinary artist who produces, well, paintings and drawings, of course, but most well known for Soundtrack to War, Rampage, and for the extraordinary footage that he contributed to the Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 documentary. He's just finished not finished a new work, he's just at the concluding stages of a new work called Miscreants, the Rise of Islamic Militant Fundamentalism in Pakistan. And just literally last weekend, we went along to a screening to have a look at the content, and a small group of artist colleagues to talk to him about that content. And for George, he was concerned about it because there was a very small smidgen of pornography in it. It was relevant to one of the characters in his new documentary, and it also showed an incredibly tough Taliban DVD snuff movie, that is, of a underage minor literally cutting off the head of an opponent, which was particularly grisly. Now, there was George wanting to get some response to that. But as an artist, I guess I make 3 observations, or I believe that George was making 3 observations. One was that he wanted to tell the truth. He wanted the kind of realism, shocking as it was. He wanted to tell it as it was, versus obviously the sensibilities of the audience. The second thing that he was talking about, I believe, was that what will convey the message best? what will make the most effective artwork? And the third thing that I think was in his mind was Australian and international film censor ratings. You know, would it get an R rating? Would it get a PG rating? How would he balance that? And that's relationship to the exposure of his particular film work. So they're the sort of considerations that artists obviously make in relation to editing their own particular work. My comment about those examples is that individual artists actually act responsibly within a self-moderating, highly critical profession. Okay, what I was actually asked to talk about wasn't experience at COFA, but I think they're worthy of comment in this context, was this phrase of testing the boundaries in relation to militarism and national security, which Tamara Winikoff suggested that I talk about. So let me just thrash through this very, very quickly. I was a young conscriptable male artist during the Vietnam War, and I was really therefore interested in the relationship between civilian populations and military political institutions. So in 1970, a long, long way back, I was a teacher at Liverpool Boys High School. I took high school students into the Holsworthy Army barracks. We did rubbings of military hardware which had just come back from Vietnam, all that kind of exposure stuff that you might expect. The Whitlam government had just come into power in 1972. I said I was a member of the public. I wanted to work on Phantom jets, which were up at the Amberley Air Force Base in Queensland. Lance Barnard, the Deputy Prime Minister and then Defence Chief, said yes. The traditional military chiefs in the Australian military said under no circumstances. So that was kind of typical of a setup of a relationship which I developed in relation to military institutions, which took me to England and the United States. Always no, 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 then a few maybes, then finally some, okay, you might be able to do this project. An observation I make in relation to this is that censorship and restrictions of any or all kinds, just in relation to that, as an artist, you should just keep on asking those questions. Just keep on asking the obvious questions. Always tell the truth and make your message clear within the broadest supporting context. Why are you doing it? What's it for? This is the context, and keep on hammering away at it. For me, at least, it got me to the Pentagon, it got me to the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington at the closing stages of the Vietnam War, and it got me not to work on humble Phantom jets, but by 1976, the very high tech, very latest F-16 Tomcats. I then sent all that material to the Soviet Union, as one would do, wanting to work with the... because they were, in a sense, they weren't goodies and baddies. This was a problem that, as an artist, I was trying to work through, and all of my good relations with the United States kind of came unstuck at that particular time. I spent the 1980s working with Eastern European military museums and artists associations, travelling around quite a bit. More recently, and I'm just coming to a quick end here, after I didn't go to Vietnam, obviously during the Vietnam War as one of those people protesting, I did eventually go to Vietnam, where I helped, I believe, build their art institutions and support their artists. I was the curator for the Vietnam artists in the APTs up in Queensland, for instance, and certainly I tried also to get close to their military institutions. More recently, working in China, I worked with a People's Liberation Army colonel, Colonel Xing Junqin. And I've been doing that work now for more than 10 years. In 2002, we had an exhibition, Xing Junqin and myself, here at Waters Gallery in Sydney, called A Bridge Too Far, a link between a dean of an art school in Sydney and a colonel in the People's Liberation Army, opened by the then Foreign Affairs spokesman, Kevin Rudd. John McDonnell's review of the show commented, Rudd's most telling point was that to gain an indication of where post-ideological China is heading, we must look towards its emerging art, literature and film industries. The importance of the role of the artist was recognised by Kevin Rudd. Fellow artists, this is true, however, boycotted the show, chastising me, saying, remember Tiananmen Square. Again, the context was missing. So my second comment here is that interpretation obviously is in the eye of the beholder. An interpretation emerges from the intent of the viewer, certainly, and the understood or misunderstood context of the work. Xing Junqin, I continue to work with, and you'd be, I think, interested to hear that I actually got him an artist-in-residence spot at the Australian Defence Force Academy. During 2003, I ended up presenting the ADFA lecture, The ad for lecture previously had been presented by Geoffrey Blaney, Malcolm Fraser and Paul Kelly from The Australian. So it was a great honour to be asked to talk about the role of artists and art residencies and PLA artists in that context as how it could indeed improve personal and national security, really by rubbing the sharp, bitter edges off between a civilian population and a military population. Just finishing up, just last year, September I think it was, I went to the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, Pyongyang. I went with you have to go with a delegation, so I went with an unlikely team, Charles Firth of the Chaser, Meredith Bergman, ex-president of the Upper House, and myself as an artist. Charles just kept on larrikin stunts, as Australians do and as the Chaser does. Meredith Bergman continued to talk about the great friendship between Australia and the disadvantaged peoples of the world. And I continued to talk about, yes, your arts and crafts are good, but can you please show me some military art? Of course, that was a difficult ask, as it's been over a 20-year history in terms of getting close to military institutions, and particularly, not surprisingly, in North Korea. One of the resolves was, though, I was allowed, without preparation and without the formal appeals process, to do a rubbing of the US Navy Pueblo, which of course was the spy ship captured by the North Koreans during the Vietnam War, which was the beginning of a continuing set of works that I will do with North Korea. So I guess the 2 points that I make here is that in fact artists working in terms of their own work are very, very sensitive, of course, of their audience, and they would continually and quite professionally edit and consider the response of that work going out into the wider sphere. The second point is, of course, if someone comes to look at the work and they again see it in a sense cold, well then the nature of art, to be adventurous, to be pushing the frontiers, it's not surprising then that it's not well understood if you don't have a clearer understanding of that background. And from my experience, that clearer understanding hasn't been there, certainly within political figures, within military institutions, and also within art colleagues. So it's an observation that I would make that context is important, but also the professional status and standing of artists is also important and obviously should be taken entirely into account. Thank you.
Ian, thank you. Now Tony Bond. And Tony, I know, has made an inner resolve as he listened to Ian that he's not going to mention any word that has a P in it. There'll be no plosives from now on. Okay, no, just obviously the microphones are extremely sensitive to Ps if we're going to broadcast this.
I can't remember if I've got any Ps, David, but I'll...
Do your best.
I'll do my best. Yeah. And I'm going to talk around the Bill Henson experience. And because Tamara asked us to write 1,200 words, which I've done almost exactly, for publication later, I'm going to read it, sorry. The Art Gallery of New South Wales owns 68 works by Bill Henson, and some of these are multiple panels, so a great many more individual panels. We began collecting the work in '81, when he was included in the first Australian Perspector. He was subsequently included in Perspector in '85 and '87 that I curated, and then toured the '87 one to Germany, to Frankfurt and Stuttgart in '88. In '95, Henson represented Australia in Venice, and the work was shown back in our gallery after Venice. So since then, he's been included in a number of theme shows at the gallery, and in 2005, we put on a major retrospective of his work, which covered all aspects of his work. This was actually the first contemporary monographic show that we'd ever ticketed at the gallery, and it was very successful. It was staged during the summer, when the gallery is full of working families. It also overlapped with Art Express, which is a time when the high schools try and book into the gallery to see their own work. But they also wanted to study Bill Henson because he's on the syllabus. And so we got 65,000 visitors through the Bill Henson buying tickets without anybody registering a formal complaint. People do complain about the toilets, the coffee, the signage, not about Bill Henson. The galleries really had to deal with complaints about art artworks on grounds of obscenity, in fact. When we do get a complaint, we make a judgment on the relevance of the complaint. And I think I've been there 25 years now, and it's only really been 2 occasions that I can recall when we've actually had to make a decision to put a work in a special room with a sign saying the work here might offend some viewers. I remember an occasion when the artist Anne MacDonald, who actually was one of our staff, complained about it, so we thought, well, that's a good thermometer. And we said, what are we going to do about it? Shall we put it in a room with a sign? And she said, no, just cover up the bits you think are rude. Thereby politicising the work and actually making the covering up part of the work. So we like to work with artists, so we did that. Now, the galleries never actually felt that Henson required such warnings. But at the moment, I have to say, we've very unobtrusively increased the security level in case of some fanatical intervention of the sort that the National Gallery of Victoria encountered with the Serrano exhibition, which they actually then closed down, which I think was a bad mistake. They haven't recovered from that mistake in many ways. But I think museums sometimes do bring woes on themselves, museums and private galleries too, probably. And I think sometimes about Brooklyn, the way they promoted the Sensation exhibition. It was inevitable that the way they promoted it, it would produce a media scandal. It is tempting to use sensational marketing to grab attention, but I've always resisted it, and in particular when I've been curating biennales, precisely because our responsibility as curators is to have the work taken seriously and not to encourage the wrong sort of sensationalism. Over the years, the gallery has continued to acquire outstanding examples from each new body of Henson's work. He always works in series. His exhibitions constitute installations where each work has been printed by the artist to create a part of an aesthetic whole. While individual works can be acquired, we have preferred to have several pieces from each series because they always create a poetic narrative when they're seen together. So with this in mind, the Senior Curator of Photography, Judy Annear, and I visited Roslyn Oxley on 20th of May to reserve a couple of photographs. Since I was one of the few people to actually see the works in question, let me describe what I saw. Large-scale photographs measuring 127 by 180 centimetres, arranged around all 3 gallery spaces at eye height. It was as if the images constituted one horizon line or vanishing point. Many of the images were were of landscapes, where twilight or sunset rendered the distances obscure. Roadways ran off into dark, brooding spaces, at once beautiful and inviting, and yet unknown and therefore fearful. This time of day, captured by the artist through the lens and then enhanced by expert developing and printing, unified all the images in the exhibition. Interspersed between landscapes were fragments of classical antiquity, interior shots of the Vatican, hauntingly present also were the images of a young boy and a girl. Most of these images were portraits in which the face filled or exceeded the entire pictorial frame. A few 3/4 length studies of the adolescent's nude were beautifully integrated into the assemblage. These were classical in their poses, and I remarked at the time that the whole feel of the exhibition was calmer, more still than any of his previous series. We reserved an image of a Roman sarcophagus and a large horizontal head of the girl. The head and the sarcophagus were both bathed in the same dark sunset lighting. The carved heads on the stone seemed almost lit from within, as did the girl's head. Both images seemed to be suspended in time and space and will hang together beautifully, hopefully capturing the essence of the exhibition as a whole. The exhibition reveals Henson's preoccupation with suspended moments of images on the brink of becoming. Never before has the place of adolescent figures seemed so natural and so poignant in the ensemble. I believe it's worth articulating this experience of the exhibition because it's in context. Most, if not all, the people decrying the work haven't even seen it. Taking individual images out of their installed context deprives them of their full meaning. Worse still, third-generation images taken from the web fail to show the extraordinary quality of the prints. Henson is one of the few artists still making large-scale prints where he controls the developing and the printing process personally. One of the policemen who came to check on Henson's works we recently had on show mistook the photographs for paintings. This is actually an easy mistake because Henson's images have a rich modulation of tone and hue, more like painting than anything we normally expect from photography. Actually, I remember a review in the Herald by Terence Malone way back when he talked about them as Baroque paintings, really. I've spoken of the context of images within installation, but I think there's another important context that goes to the heart of the matter of censorship as I see it. Henson made these images to be shown in a private gallery or a museum, or for that matter, a private collection. And this is a very specific context in which he can safely assume that the audience will be informed and thoughtful and attuned to the aesthetic quality of his art. Artists don't deserve to live by different rules, but when art is presented to its intended audience in the way it was conceived, production and reception occupy a space of common understanding. For the past 30 years, this understanding and this specific audience, including high school certificate students, has functioned as it should. As a result of the current intervention, a wider audience has been exposed to grossly misrepresented fragments of the work. How could the public possibly be expected to make a sensible or informed judgment based on such misrepresentations? It has to be acknowledged that the existence of the web makes it possible for degraded versions of artworks to be circulated beyond their intended context, and this is a subject that we need to discuss in the light, I would say, of this threat to an artist, his dealer, and presumably to most public galleries in Australia who own his work and provide online access to their collections. We have a copyright clause in our website which makes it illegal to take and publish these images, but we know that some people break the law, don't they? The outstanding question for me is, what exactly is considered revolting in this exhibition? Is it the child? Is it adolescence? It certainly can't be the photo. Henson's photos are probably the most beautiful photographic objects ever made. Is it the sexual context? And what exactly does that mean? The images in this exhibition are of a demure child, self-absorbed, caught in classical poses, very still. Does nudity now constitute sexual context alone? Can society and its laws distinguish between philosophical and aesthetic exploration of sexuality as opposed to exploitation of images intended only to titillate? The law has always had a problem interpreting matters of aesthetics, which is why our public institutions charged with exercising scholarship in these matters should be allowed to responsibly make these judgments in the framework of their duty to display and interpret works of art. Thank you.